Welcome everyone on MoreToChess. The Ftx Crypto Cup has already started and the game we all been waiting for weeks is now in front of us. The challenger versus the defending champion. Here Magnus Carlsen is playing with the white pieces and Ian Nepomniachtchi with black pieces. So let's start. Magnus starts with the move e4. Ian plays c5, knight c3, knight to e6, knight to f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4 and queen c7. This opening setup is known as Bastrikov variation of Paulsen variation Sicilian defense. White plays bishop e3 and now a6 preventing knight b5 ideas, bishop to e2 developing the bishop, b5 black is ready to attack, now knight takes c6, queen takes c6 and e5. Here white is offering the g2 pawn in exchange of fixing the d7 f7 pawn with the idea of queen d3 long castle and attack. Black plays bishop b7 developing his black bishop. Now bishop f3 attacking the queen, queen c7, bishop takes and queen d3 with the idea of long castle. Now black plays knight e7, white plays bishop c5, pinning this bishop, creating more hindrance to development of the black pieces. Now queen takes g2 attacking this rook, long castle, queen c6 retreating the queen with the tempo attacking the bishop. Now knight e4 protecting the bishop and also eyeing down in this strong d6 square. Now knight f5 also creating some power, giving some power to d6 square. Bishop cross f8, rook cross f8 and now black cannot castle. White plays rook h to e1 developing his last piece. Now black plays rook c8 putting more pressure on the c2 with some mating threats. Now king b1 and prophylactic move, black plays f6. f6 is a mistake. Instead of f6 the best reply from black is rook h8. Now c3 releasing the pressure on the c2 pawn and black plays a5 with the attack on the white king, and the position is theoretically equal and practically very much playable for black. But black plays f6, it is a mistake, and in response Magnus also gives a blunder. The best move for white here is e takes f6, g6. Here you cannot take the pawn. If g takes f6 then knight c5 with a double attack on d7, and since the king is pinned the black knight is also threatened. So rook f7, knight cross e6, d takes e6 and queen cross f5 with a double attack on the e6 pawn, and the black king is totally shattered. White is plus here. After g6 also the black's position is very weak and white have an advantage. But instead here Magnus played f4 and now Ian played f cross e5, and now here black can make use of this f8 rook without any problem. Black plays h6 preventing some knight g5 ideas. White played rook g1. Here since the black knight has a very good outpost on f5 square, so it protects not only the g7 h6 but it also eyes on the weak d6 square of black. Here black played queen d5. Here Ian wants to exchange the queens and land into endgame, but this is a blunder because now white played the move knight d6 check, taking the exchange. Now here you cannot take the knight with the knight because after queen g6 check your queen will be hanging. So instead now come back to this position. Instead of queen d5 the best response for black here is rook to f7, and now after knight d6 check you can just take with the knight because there is no queen g6 check. White have to take with the pawn, and now queen f3, the game goes on exchanging the queens. Now queen h7, queen to f6, queen h8 check, rook f8 and the position is drawn. Even if you take this pawn, because after queen takes g7, queen takes g7, rook cross g7 and rook c5, it is also equal since white has weak back rank and also weak d6 pawn. So this gives black enough time to manage the situation. So let's go back to the original position. After queen d5, knight d6 check, black have to play king e7. Now knight cross c8 check, rook takes c8, queen cross d5, e takes d5, rook cross d5. White obviously want to exchange more pieces since white is exchange up and in a completely winning position, but Ian managed to somehow draw in a time pressure. Here black played king to e6, attacking both the rook and pawn. Rook d3, g5. Here king cross e5 is not a good idea because after rook takes d7 the position is clear cut and very easy to win, but instead Ian wants to complicate the position because he is exchanged down. So he played g5, a4. The idea of a4 is after a cross b5, a cross b5, the b5 pawn is more exposed and isolated, so white has created a weakness. After b cross a4, white played rook g4, attacking this a4 pawn. Now rook c6, defending this pawn and also freeing the knight from the d6 square since rook d6 check is always coming to take this pawn. Now white played rook takes a4, h5, black wants to create a passed pawn. White played rook d to a3. Instead white has an intermediate move which is more active, which is rook to h3, attacking the h5 pawn. Black have to play knight g7. If black did not play knight g7 and played h4, then rook g4 wins this g5 pawn. So black have to play knight g7. Now rook h to a3. Coming back to a3 now, this position is better because the knight is less active than before. But Magnus plays rook d to a3 right away. Black plays g4, king to c1. Here the more active way to go instead of king b1 is rook cross a6, king cross e5, and now rook 3 to a5 check, king f4. Black king will come near to this h2 pawn. Now rook a8 with the idea of rook f8 and attacking this knight. Rook to g6 with the idea of rook g5. Now rook f8, rook g5 and b4. Now white is winning here since white's pawn queens first. Now come back to this position. White plays king c1, black plays king cross e5, rook takes a6. Now h4 with the idea of pushing g3, rook takes c6, d takes c6, king d1, taking his king all the way to the right. Black played s3. Now king e2. King e2 is the blunder that ends all the advantage for white. Here the best move is rook a8. After that black will respond with knight d4. Now king e1, knight f3 check, taking this pawn. Now king f2, knight cross s2 and rook f8, cutting off this king first. Instead of rook f8, if you play king g3 right away, then this game will also draw. After knight f1 check, king takes g4, h2, rook h8 and king e4 since the rook's duty is to always cover the h1 square. White equalizes the game after playing king to e2. Black plays g3 right away, taking advantage of the situation. Now king to f3. It is very obvious that you cannot take this pawn with h pawn or the rook because after h cross g3, h2 and rook cross g3, knight cross g3, h cross g3, h2. So white have to play king to f3. Now g cross h2 and queening the pawn with the threat. Since the g2 pawn is blocked, so white have to play rook a1. Now knight d4 check, king to g3, knight cross c2 attacking the rook, rook to c1 attacking the knight, knight b4, king takes h2, king d4, b3, c5, king takes s3. Now knight c6 with the idea of putting the knight on this square and push the pawn with a drawing game. Now rook c4 check, king to d5, king g2, knight e5 attacking the rook and trying to push the pawn, rook c1, c4, he pushed the pawn, b takes c4, knight takes c4, rook takes c4, king takes c4, and the game resulted in a draw. I am very much thrilled by watching the game online. I hope you also enjoyed the game. Stay tuned for more contents. Bye bye.